My name is Ray Aldridge. I worked for the National Park Service for 22 years, and 19 of those years were on the Blue Ridge Parkway, assigned to the northern North Carolina section, primarily from milepost 217 near the Virginia line south to milepost 280 in the high country of Watauga County. I was a law enforcement ranger, which means my job was not leading interpretive walks or staffing a visitor center. I drove the road, responded to accidents and medical emergencies, conducted search and rescue operations, investigated criminal activity on Parkway property, and managed the ongoing incidents that a 469-mile linear park generates when it runs through some of the most sparsely populated terrain in the eastern United States. I want you to understand who I am before I tell you what happened, because the way you hear this depends on who is saying it. I am not someone who saw something from a distance and filled in the gaps with what I wanted to believe. I had 22 years of professional observation behind me. I was trained to document what I saw, note what I could not confirm, and keep those two things separated from each other. When I pulled dashcam footage for an incident report, I was not pulling it to see anything. I was pulling it to document what the camera could verify so that a report I signed my name to would be accurate. The northern North Carolina section of the Blue Ridge Parkway is not the stretch that shows up in the tourism photographs. That is the southern end, the area around Asheville and the craggy gardens and the sweeping views of the Black Mountains. What I patrolled was the rough end. From Cumberland Knob at the Virginia line down through Doughton Park and beyond, the parkway runs along steep ridgelines through Allegheny County, Wilkes County, and into Caldwell County, and for long stretches it passes through nothing but ridge and forest. Outside of a few developed areas like Doughton Park near the southern end of my zone, the section offered no visitor facilities, no campgrounds, no overlooks designed for crowds, just the road and the mountain and whatever comes off the mountain at night. The parkway was built under the New Deal in the 1930s, and most of the land it crosses through in the northern North Carolina section was acquired through condemnation of small farms and timber holdings going back to that era. That acquisition history means there are old roads and foundations and wells and burial plots in the forest along the parkway that are not marked on any current map because they predate the park boundary by several decades. I mention this not because it is directly relevant to what I am going to tell you, but because it shapes the character of that landscape. You are driving through land that has a long human history and a current human absence, and at night, especially in the fall and winter, when the leaves are off the trees and the ridgeline stands bare against the sky, that combination produces a quality that takes some getting used to. I got used to it. After 19 years, I would say I got comfortable with it. The road had rhythms I knew. The deer crossings were predictable by season and by mile marker. The fog patterns were predictable by drainage. I knew where the radio repeaters had gaps, where the pavement iced before anywhere else in a freeze, where the drop-off on the right shoulder was severe enough that I kept my passenger side tires well away from the edge even in dry conditions. I drove that road with the confidence of someone who had driven it several thousand times in every season and every weather pattern those mountains produce. That confidence is part of what I need you to understand, because what happened on the 14th of November 2022 did not happen to someone who was spooked or unfamiliar or running tired or impaired in any way. It happened to a 19-year veteran of that specific road on a standard evening patrol in conditions I had driven in many times before. Before I get to November 14th, I want to tell you what a standard night patrol on that section of Parkway actually looks like, because it matters to the point I am trying to make about what I did and did not experience. A night shift on the northern North Carolina section typically runs from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. In summer, you have late visitors, hikers coming off trails, the occasional car pulled over at an overlook with people looking at the stars. In fall, after peak foliage season ends in mid-October, the visitor numbers drop sharply. By November, you might see 3 or 4 other vehicles in a 6-hour shift. Some nights, none. The parkway does not close in the northern North Carolina section until weather requires it. But the practical reality is that on a cold November night, with fog building in the drainages, you are driving a 6.5-mile stretch of mountain road in conditions that most people with any common sense are not choosing to be out in. That is not a complaint. I was comfortable in those conditions, and I was comfortable with the solitude. What it means for this account is that when I describe sitting in that stalled truck for 47 minutes with no awareness of another presence, you should understand that I was attuned to the sounds and the movements and the general quality of quiet on that road, the way a person who spends several thousand hours a year in a specific environment gets attuned to it. I knew what belonged and what did not. I knew the difference between a deer moving through understory and a coyote moving through understory, and I could often tell from the sound alone without seeing the animal. I knew the particular quality of silence that follows a large animal that has just moved through a space, and the slightly different quality of a space that has no large animal in it at all. In 47 minutes outside that truck in those conditions, whatever the camera recorded was producing neither of those. It was producing the second kind, the absolute stillness of a space with nothing animate in it. That is what I heard for 47 minutes, and that is what the camera was telling me had been false. That evening, I started my shift at the administrative pull-off near Cumberland Knob at 7 in the evening and ran my first loop north to the state line and back. By 9:30, I was running the road south again, heading toward the Doughton Park area. The temperature at Sparta, the county seat of Allegheny County, had been 34 degrees when I started, and was dropping as the night went on. There had been light rain through the afternoon, a cold drizzle that had stopped around 7 p.m., and the pavement was still damp in the lower sections. The air was saturated and the fog was building in the drainage gaps. I need to describe this fog in some detail because it matters to what I found later. Fog on a mountain road is not one consistent thing. It pools in the hollows and thins along the open ridgeline. What you get driving the parkway in these conditions is something intermittent. A quarter mile of moderate visibility, 60 or 70 feet, and then you drop into a fog pocket, and you are suddenly driving in 3-0-foot visibility, and then you come back out the other side and it opens again. You learn to slow for the pockets. You learn which sections of road produce them, and you are ready before you get there. I had been driving in and out of fog pockets for 2 hours by the time I reached the stretch approaching milepost 221. I was running with my low beams on. High beams in fog at night reflect off the moisture and reduce your effective visibility, which is counterintuitive, but true. Low beams project their light downward and forward, keeping it below the worst of the fog layer, giving you those 40 or 50 feet of usable forward vision rather than washing out everything in front of you in a wall of reflected white. I was doing 28 miles per hour. I had slowed from my standard patrol speed because the fog in that section had been dense for the past half mile, and I was being careful about it. I was watching the center line, which is what you watch in fog. You keep your eye on that broken yellow stripe, and you let it tell you where the road goes. The section approaching milepost 221.4 comes around a right-hand curve with a slight uphill grade. The mountain is on the left, the embankment side, and the drop is on the right, with no guardrail for roughly a third of a mile through that stretch. The drop side falls away sharply into a drainage at the base of the ridge. The curve itself is not severe. It is one I had taken hundreds of times without incident. As the headlights swept around the inside of that curve and illuminated the short straight section beyond it, I had approximately 2 seconds of clear sight. There was something in the right lane. Upright. Large. Standing in the center of the right lane, approximately 35 feet from the front of the truck. I had those 2 seconds, and I used them the way 19 years on that road had grooved into me. I registered height. I registered the upright posture. I did not have time to register anything else because my foot was already going to the brake and my hands were already turning the wheel left, away from the drop side. Left was the mountain. Left was the embankment. That was the calculation, and it was correct for what the road looked like in that moment. The front right corner of the truck hit the embankment at an angle, not head-on. The impact was sharp and heavy, a hard compression through the right side of the cab, and the airbag deployed. The engine stalled at, or immediately after impact. The truck came to rest at roughly a 20-degree angle, nose in toward the embankment on the left side of the road. Rear of the truck angled back into the right lane. The airbag deflated. Dust and the chemical smell of the deployment agent were in the cab. I sat still for a moment that I cannot accurately measure. Then I ran my inventory. Wrist. Left. It had been against the steering wheel when the bag went, and the impact was immediate and significant. I filed that under not good and moved on. Ribs. Left side. From the seatbelt. Sharp and present and promising to get worse before it got better. Forehead. Something from the edge of the bag housing, and I could feel the wetness of it above my left eye without needing to touch it. I assessed those things, and then I reached for the radio with my right hand. Dispatch. This is Ranger Aldridge, 10 to 50 at milepost, 221.4 southbound. Vehicle contact with embankment. I am ambulatory. Requesting EMS and backup. The parkway has radio repeaters along the ridge, and that section had decent coverage. Dispatch came back in 12 seconds. They had my GPS coordinates from the trucks unit. Allegheny County EMS was being routed out of Sparta. Ranger Holt was being notified. Estimated arrival on the first unit was 35 to 45 minutes. I acknowledged, set the handset down, and took stock. The headlights were off. The engine was off. The emergency light bar on the roof was still active, running on the truck battery, and I left it going. It would help EMS and Holt find my position, even though there was unlikely to be any other traffic on the road at that hour. The interior lights had come on faintly when the engine cut out, the battery-powered courtesy lights, and they gave me enough illumination to see my hands and the dash and the windshield. Outside the windshield it was dark, dense dark, mountain dark at 3,000 feet with no moon and the fog sitting against the ridge. I could see the road surface immediately in front of the truck in the rotating sweep of the light bar. But that light was fragmentary, not sustained, and it did not reach far. Beyond the immediate circle of that sweep, there was nothing but the shape of the embankment on the left and the general blackness of the right shoulder. I reached behind the seat with my right arm and got the emergency blanket from the kit bag, getting it open and around my shoulders one-handed with the wrist on the left side sending steady signals of complaint was not graceful, but I managed it. Then I sat. What I heard over the next 47 minutes is something I have tried to describe accurately to several people, and I am going to try to describe it accurately here because it is important. The parkway in November at night at 3,000 feet is not silent. There is wind. The November wind at that elevation has a quality that is hard to explain to someone who has not sat in it on a still evening. It moves through bare trees differently than through summer foliage. In summer, you get a sustained rushing of leaves. In November, the leaves are gone, and what you hear is branches, individual movements, the clicking and shifting of dormant wood against other dormant wood. I heard that wind through the cab. I heard what I believed was a small creek somewhere in the drainage below the embankment on my left, a trickle that the afternoon rain had fed into something audible. I heard, once, what I was nearly certain was a great horned owl somewhere to the south of my position, the low resonant double note it uses when calling from a rest point. I want to describe those 47 minutes in more detail than I have so far, because the detail is relevant to understanding what the recording meant when I watched it. After I radioed dispatch and got confirmation that EMS was en route, I did what any rational person does when they are injured and alone and waiting for help that is some time away. I focused on staying functional. The wrist was wrapped with the ACE bandage from the first aid kit. Not well, but adequately, because wrapping something one-handed is imprecise work. The blanket was around my shoulders. I had a half bottle of water from the cup holder, and I drank part of it because Torres would want to know if I had taken anything, and water was not a complication. I kept the radio on low volume, and I listened to the dispatch channel, and I did not transmit again until dispatch checked on me. I was aware of time passing in the way you are aware of it, when you are waiting and uncomfortable, and there is nothing you can do about either thing. The light bar rotated and threw its sweep across the embankment and the road surface in a regular rhythm. The interior lights faded slowly as the battery drew down over the first 20 minutes, and then stabilized at a dim glow that was enough to read the gauges by, but not much more. What I thought about, in the sections between checking the wrist and monitoring the radio and keeping track of the time, was the thing I had seen in the road before the swerve. I had 19 years on that road. In 19 years, I had swerved for deer more times than I could count, for wild turkey running low across the pavement, for a black bear 3 separate times in the section north of Doughton Park. I had never swerved for anything that produced the impression that what was in the road was not an animal. What was in the road had been upright. That was the impression I had in those 2 seconds, and I had not questioned it in the moment, and I was not questioning it now, sitting in the cab. Deer rear up. I knew that. But the posture I had registered in 2 seconds of headlight illumination had not been a deer rearing. It had been the standing posture of something that stood upright as its natural orientation. I had processed that in the fraction of a second before the swerve, and the processing had been correct enough to send my hands left rather than right, because the left side was the mountain and the right was the drop, and something upright and large in the right lane that was not fleeing in either direction was not a deer. I thought about that. I thought about what it might have been. I had no good answer, and I was in enough discomfort that prolonged theoretical thinking was not easy to sustain. I let it go. I listened to the owl call once more, sometime around the 3:0 mark. I watched the light bar sweep. I waited. The owl was real. I had no doubt of that. What it tells me, in retrospect, is that the area around that truck was behaving like an area with no large disturbance in it. Owls do not call from rest positions in the presence of anything that concerns them. They are tuned to disturbance. Whatever was standing at the tree line 22 feet from the front of my truck was not registering to a great horned owl as something to be concerned about. And a great horned owl is considerably more sensitive to that kind of information than I am. I have thought about what that means. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear anything that suggested another person was outside that truck. I want to be precise about this. At 28 miles per hour on impact, the truck had come to rest no more than a few feet past the contact point with the embankment. The road surface I had been driving was asphalt, which means the verge on the right side of the road, between the asphalt edge and the near tree line, was compressed gravel and forest soil with a layer of November leaf litter on top of it. Anything weighing more than 40 or 50 pounds and moving through that verge would have produced sound. At 22 feet, in still mountain air, I would have heard it. I had heard deer at that range in similar conditions hundreds of times. I had heard coyotes at 40 feet on similar nights. My windows were up, but the driver's side glass is thin and sound carries through it. I heard nothing. Dispatch checked on me at 10:10, and again at 10:22. I told them I was stable both times because I was within the meaning of the word. The wrist was swelling and the ribs made deep breathing something to be approached with caution. But I was conscious and warm enough with the blanket and I was not going anywhere. I sat and I listened to the mountain and I waited. The EMS unit from Sparta came up the parkway from the north at 10:34 in the evening. I heard the siren before I saw the headlights. It wound its way up the road toward me over the span of a few minutes, the Doppler compression of it shifting as the vehicle worked through the curves. And when the lights came around the far bend to the north, I keyed my emergency light to the higher intensity setting to mark my position. The paramedics were a young man named Torres and his partner, and Torres was professional and no nonsense. He did not argue with me, but he also did not let me argue with him. Torres assessed a probable wrist fracture, 2 probable rib fractures, and a head laceration, and I was going on a gurney. He was right on all 3 counts, as it turned out. Ranger Frank Holt arrived 8 minutes after the EMS unit, coming from the south where he had been running the lower portion of my zone. He stayed with the truck while Torres and his partner got me into the unit. I remember the sound of the equipment doors closing and then the motion of the ambulance moving out. And after that, my memory of the ride to Sparta is fragmented, which the concussion would account for. Allegheny Memorial Hospital in Sparta evaluated me and transferred me to Watauga Medical Center in Boone the following morning for imaging. The distal radius of my left wrist had a hairline fracture at the base of the thumb side, a fracture that does not require surgery, but does require immobilization. 2 ribs cracked on the left, both in the midsection, no separation. The forehead laceration was 7 stitches, and some swelling around the brow that made me look considerably worse than I felt. The concussion was assessed as mild, but warranted an overnight observation stay in Boone. Frank drove me home from Watauga Medical Center on the afternoon of November 16th. I live in Laurel Springs in Allegheny County, about 9 miles from the Parkway entrance on NC-18, in a house my wife Sandra and I bought when I transferred to the northern section 15 years ago. Frank helped me inside, made sure I had what I needed, and left with a promise that he would check in the next day. Sandra had driven over from Laurel Springs the previous evening and stayed in Boone overnight. She had the painkillers and the soup and the particular quiet way she has when something has gone wrong, and she is focused on getting things right. I did the 5 weeks in a splint on modified duty at the Asheville Administrative Office. The wrist was not the only reason I put in for the desk assignment, though I told myself it was. I filed the narrative section of the incident report during the second week of modified duty. The camera footage documentation I deferred, something I had never done in 22 years with the service. I told myself the reason was that I needed the wrist functional enough to handle the keyboard for an extended documentation session, and that was partially true. The formal incident report documentation for any crash involving a duty vehicle requires a written narrative and attached camera file with timestamp documentation. That camera footage has to be logged into the evidence system with the relevant timestamps noted, and the ranger who files the report has to review the recording and sign off that the attached file is complete and unedited. It is not an optional process. I knew that. I had watched other rangers go through it after incidents of their own. I put off doing it for myself for 3 weeks after I returned from modified duty, which is 5 weeks of modified duty plus 3 weeks of returning to patrol, 8 weeks after the crash. I sat down with it on a Tuesday evening in early January 2023. Sandra was reading in the other room. I had the laptop on the kitchen table, the Axon Evidence desktop application loaded, and a cup of coffee to my right. The file was queued up. I had been assigned an Axon Fleet dashcam in 2019 when the Parkway started equipping patrol units, and I had reviewed footage from it before, though only for minor incidents and routine stop documentation. I had never pulled it for a crash involving myself. I jumped to the timestamp at 9:47, which the GPS data confirmed as the moment of impact, and played the sequence. What you see first is the road, southbound Parkway, approaching the curve at milepost 221.4. The Axon Fleet records at 1080 resolution, and the night vision is serviceable in conditions like those. The integrated infrared illumination activates below a certain ambient light threshold and renders the scene in the gray-white wash that night camera footage produces. And in that wash, the center line, the asphalt surface, and the right shoulder were all clearly visible. I watched the curve approach in the headlights. I watched my own truck's reaction as it swept around the bend, then the road ahead, open, straight, maybe 40 feet of clear sight, and then the upright form in the right lane. I had not had a clear look at it during the incident itself. 2 seconds and a swerve and an airbag, and that had been the totality of my observation at the time. Watching the recording was the first opportunity I had to see what had been in the road. The IR rendering shows it in that gray-white wash, and what I could make out in the 2 seconds of footage before the swerve was the basic vertical orientation, the approximate height, the fact that it was occupying the right lane and not the shoulder. I could not make out features. I could not make out details. I could make out that it was upright and that it was substantial. Then the swerve and the impact, a hard sound on the audio track, and the airbag filling the frame. The bag deflated. The dust settled over perhaps 20 seconds. The camera stabilized on the post-crash view. I was playing at normal speed, 4 minutes into the post-crash footage, watching for the milepost marker at the right shoulder to confirm my documented position, when I noticed something at the right edge of the frame. I paused the playback. I moved the cursor back 20 seconds and pressed play again. There was a form standing at the right margin of the camera's field of view. It was at the gap between the asphalt edge and the tree line, 22 to 25 feet from the front of the truck by my estimate based on the known distance to the tree line at that location. The Axon Fleet's infrared illumination had activated in the low-light conditions, rendering everything in that gray-white wash. And in that wash against the dark tree line, there was a vertical form, upright, proportioned approximately like a person, standing still. I let it play. It did not move. I went back to the very first stable frame after the airbag deflated and played from there. The form was present in the first clear frame, not stepping into the frame, not emerging from the tree line, already there. Present at the right margin of the camera's view in the first moment, the camera had a clear angle after the crash. I took my hand off the mouse. I sat with what I was looking at for a long moment. Then I went back to the pre-crash footage and played forward through the swerve and the impact. In the headlights before the crash, the form was standing in the right lane, in the road, 35 feet ahead. During the impact sequence, the camera shook and the angle changed. When it stabilized on the post-crash view, the form was no longer in the right lane. It was at the tree line on the right shoulder. It had moved from the center of the right lane to the tree line in the interval of the crash. I played the post-crash footage forward from the first stable frame, 10 minutes, 20. The form did not move. I checked the timestamp at the start of its appearance, and then played forward to where I could see the first approaching lights of the EMS unit in the far background, 47 minutes and 13 seconds. Whatever was standing at that tree line had been there for 47 minutes and 13 seconds without moving. I pushed my chair back and stood up. Then I sat back down. I went through it once more, methodically, the way I would work through any piece of evidence. Start to finish. No assumptions, no skipping. What the camera showed was consistent across every pass. A form at the right margin of the frame, at the tree line, stationary. From the first second of stable post-crash video to the moment the responding lights appeared in the background, and in the frame that first contained those headlights, the right margin of the frame was empty. I poured the cold coffee down the kitchen sink and made a fresh cup, and I sat back down and went through it again. Methodical, looking for anything that could explain it away. A deer standing at the tree line for 47 minutes would not account for the height or the proportions. A tree at the edge of the frame that I had misidentified would not account for the motion of the form, the way it had moved from the road to the tree line in the crash interval. A camera artifact would not account for either of those things. I was a long time sitting there. I want to tell you about the specific details I found on the second and third passes through the recording, because those details are what pulled me past, thinking this was an odd anomaly, and into sitting at a kitchen table at midnight, understanding that something had been outside that truck the entire time I was in it. The form stood between 6 feet 2 and 6 feet 4 inches tall. I could not determine that from the recording alone, and I could not determine it that night. What I could see was that the form cleared the milepost marker post at the right shoulder of the road, which is a white painted post set at approximately 42 inches above the ground. The form cleared that post by something close to a third of its total height. I noted that and moved on. The arms were long. That was the next thing I noticed. After the stillness, they hung at the sides and extended lower than proportions I was accustomed to seeing. Lower than the hip in the way that a normal arm hangs. Lower than mid-thigh. I am 6 feet tall, with reasonably long arms, and my hands hang at mid-thigh comfortably. The form's arms extended lower than that relative to its height, though in an infrared recording at 22 feet the margin of precision is limited. The form did not produce visible breath vapor. I noticed this on my third pass. It was 34 degrees outside and the air was wet from the earlier rain. A person standing still in 3-4 degree saturated air exhales visible moisture with each breath, and in the cold, that moisture condenses into a visible puff that an infrared camera at 22 feet would show. I watched the area around the form's head and upper torso through 12 minutes of footage looking for that condensation. I did not see it. I know what the absence of visible breath vapor does and does not mean. Camera angle, ambient humidity, the specific characteristics of the IR illumination at that range. There are variables that could account for it. I am telling you what the camera showed, and what it showed was a form that stood in cold, saturated air for a measured 47 minutes without visible exhalation. On my fourth pass through the recording, I found the detail that I have spent the most time with since. At the 2-3 minute mark, the form's head moved, not the body, not a step in any direction, just the head. A slow rotation, deliberate, covering approximately 20 degrees of arc over the course of 4 seconds, and then stopping. I went frame by frame through that section of the recording 6 times. I counted the seconds. I measured the final resting angle of the head against what I could determine about the geometry of the scene from 22 feet away. When the movement stopped, the head angle cleared the windshield entirely, cleared the hood and the front end of the truck. It was angled at the driver's side door, at the left side of the truck, at the window, at the place where I had been sitting for the previous 23 minutes of the dark. not knowing anything was out there. Thinking I was entirely alone on that mountain road with the wind and the owl and the sound of the creek below the ridge. The crash had not held its attention. It had turned its head to look at me. I did not call Sandra in from the other room. I shut the laptop and sat at that kitchen table for a long time before I went to bed. When I did go to bed, I did not sleep well. I am not someone who has trouble sleeping as a general rule. 22 years of night shifts trains you to sleep when you can, and the habit is durable. But that Tuesday night in January, I was awake at 1 a.m. and I was awake at 2 and I was awake at 3:30 and I gave up on it around 4 and went back to the kitchen table and opened the laptop again. I played through the recording 5 more times before the sky started getting light outside the kitchen window. Each time I was looking for something I might have missed, anything that would make the first conclusion less solid, some artifact or environmental factor I had not accounted for. I looked carefully at the tree line for other shapes that might have produced the silhouette. I looked at the milepost post from different timestamps to see if the light from the bar was creating an optical effect at that margin. I went through the infrared registration carefully, checking whether the illumination was behaving consistently or whether there was some fluctuation that might account for a false positive at that range. There was nothing. The recording was clean. The form was there in the first stable frame, and it was gone in the frame containing the first approaching lights, and in between those 2 points, it stood at the edge of the road for 47 minutes and 13 seconds, and did not move except for the head rotation at the 23-minute mark. By 5 a.m. I had gone through it enough times that I was not going to find anything new in additional passes. I closed the laptop and made coffee, and sat at the table, and thought about what a person who deals with evidence for a living does when the evidence does not have a clean explanation. The answer I came to was that you do not discard evidence because you cannot explain it. You note what it shows, you note your uncertainty about interpretation, and you continue to investigate. I had not finished investigating. I had the height estimate, but I had not verified it against a physical measurement. I had the absence of tracks, but I had not confirmed it with a second observer. I had not yet retrieved the 2 archived records Janet Oakes would later find, and I had not yet spoken to anyone outside of what the recording itself showed. There was more to do. I wrote a list. The way I deal with things I cannot explain is to write them down the way I would write up an evidence sheet. 2 columns, 1 for what I observed, 1 for what I did not observe. What I wrote in the first column was this: a form at the right margin of the camera's field of view, present from the first stable frame of post-crash video, present for 47 minutes and 13 seconds, measured by timestamp, gone in the frame that contained the first approaching headlights from the north. Estimated height, 6 feet, 2 to 6 feet, 4, based on comparison with the milepost marker post. Arms appearing longer relative to body height than I would expect. No visible breath vapor during the observation period. 1 head rotation at the 2-3 minute mark, covering approximately 20 degrees, stopping at an angle consistent with looking at the driver's side door and window. What I wrote in the second column was this: I did not observe the form approach the position at the tree line during the pre-crash sequence. I did not observe it at any point after the EMS lights first appeared in the background. I heard nothing from outside the truck during the 47-minute wait that suggested any presence at that range or any other range. The responding personnel made no notation of any observer at the scene in any of the documented paperwork I had access to. I also wrote down my questions, separately. Where had the form gone in the 3 seconds between its last appearance in the frame and the frame containing the first approaching headlights? In a recording running at 30 frames per second, that interval was 90 frames. In 90 frames at the recorded distance, a person walking would have covered roughly 8 feet. The tree line at the right edge of the camera's view was approximately 6 feet from the form's standing position. Walking into the trees would account for the disappearance. But the frames themselves showed nothing in motion at the margin. The form was present in one frame and absent in the next, and there was no transitional frame showing movement. I wrote that question down and left it unanswered. I called Frank Holt at 7:30 the next morning. He was already on his way into the district. I asked if he had time to come by that evening and look at something with me. He asked what kind of something. I told him it was dashcam footage from the crash and I needed a second set of eyes on it. Frank said he would come by. Frank Holt had been with the Parkway for 16 years by that point, with the northern North Carolina section for all of them. He and I had run the same patrol zone for a decade, and I trusted his read on things more than I trusted most people's. Frank was not excitable and did not come to conclusions before the evidence did. If I showed him the recording and he found a mundane explanation I had missed, I wanted to hear it. He arrived at the house that evening at 6 p.m. Sandra made coffee and found reasons to be elsewhere in the house, which is the way she manages situations, when she understands that the conversation is not one she needs to be present for, but also is not a conversation she is fully comfortable leaving. I was aware of that, but I did not change anything about how I walked Frank through it. I showed him the pre-crash sequence first, then the crash itself, then the post-crash stable footage with the form at the tree line. I did not say anything while he watched. Frank has a particular stillness when he is processing something. He held his coffee mug in both hands and he watched the screen, and his expression did not change in any way that I could read. He asked me to play the section around the 2-3 minute mark again. I played it twice. Then he asked if he could take the laptop for a few minutes. He went through the recording the way I had, forward and back, checking the sections I had spent time on, and then some I had not looked at as carefully. He was at it for about 15 minutes. Then he closed the laptop screen and set his hands flat on the table. I want to tell you more specifically about what Frank found when he went through the recording on his own, because his observations confirmed some of what I had seen and added a detail I had not focused on. Frank's methodical approach has nothing theatrical about it. There is no performance of carefulness, just the actual practice of it. And I have seen it enough times to know the difference. He went through the crash sequence twice without comment, then moved through the post-crash footage in 2 passes, once at normal speed and once frame by frame through the sections I had flagged. The longest time he spent was on the 23-minute mark, where the head rotation occurred. What he pointed out to me, going through that section, was something I had noted but not articulated precisely. The head rotation did not begin at the 23-minute mark exactly. It began at the 22-minute and 44-second mark, and it took 4 seconds, meaning it was complete at approximately 22 minutes and 48 seconds. Frank's observation was that this was approximately 15 to 18 minutes before the first EMS lights appeared in the far background. 15 to 18 minutes is a significant interval in the context of a rural EMS response. It is the interval between being in transit and being close enough to be a few minutes out. It is the interval in which a responding unit, having been en route for 20-some minutes on mountain roads from Sparta, would be making the final approach to the Parkway entrance from NC-18. Frank did not say explicitly what he thought that timing might mean. I did not either. We sat with it for a moment and then he moved on to the rest of the recording, but the observation was noted. The form had turned its head with approximately 15 minutes remaining in the wait, and it had been gone before the first lights appeared in the frame. Frank's other observation was about the position of the form at the right margin. The camera's field of view on the Axon fleet in that installation was approximately 130 degrees wide. In the post-crash position, with the truck angled toward the embankment, the right margin of the frame was aimed roughly at the direction the responding unit would come from. The form was standing at the right margin. It was standing in the direction from which help was going to arrive. Whether it was watching the truck or watching the road, Frank said, was not something the recording could answer definitively. He said it mattered which one was true, and he said we could not know. And then he closed the laptop. He asked me how tall the milepost marker post was at that location. I told him it was approximately 42 inches at installation. That was the standard. He said he wanted to drive out there the following morning and measure it himself, and also look at the ground at the right shoulder in that area. We drove out to milepost 221.4 on a Thursday morning in early January. The weather was clear and cold, 28 degrees at 8 in the morning at that elevation, the sky pale and cloudless. The section of road looked exactly as it always had. The gouge marks from the truck's right front corner were still visible in the embankment on the left, raw earth showing through the frost-killed vegetation. The milepost post was at the right shoulder where it always was. The verge between the asphalt edge and the tree line was flat-packed ground, with a layer of damp November leaf litter that had been undisturbed since the rain. Frank pulled a tape measure from his jacket pocket and went to the post. He measured it at 43 inches from the ground surface to the top of the cap. We took photographs. Then we walked to the area where the recording placed the form. The verge in that section runs approximately 8 feet wide from the asphalt edge to the nearest trees. The soil under the leaf layer is clay-heavy forest soil, the kind that takes an impression readily when it is wet. It had been wet continuously since the November rain. The physical examination of the site was more thorough than I have described so far, and the thoroughness is relevant. Frank and I were at that section of road for close to 2 hours. We documented everything with photographs and then measured the milepost, the width of the verge from asphalt edge to tree line, and the distance from the front of the truck's impact point to the position at the tree line where the recording placed the form. That distance, verified physically, was 21 feet and 4 inches. The camera had placed it at 22 to 25 feet, based on my initial estimate. Physical measurement put it closer than I had thought. We looked at the tree line itself. The nearest trees at that point were second-growth hardwood, mixed oak and hickory with some sweet gum. None of them old growth, all of them second-growth hardwood forest, the type that fills in former pasture and farmland over 40 or 50 years. The ground between the trees was open enough in that section to walk through without difficulty. A person moving from the verge into the trees and through them would not have been stopped by the understory. Not in November when the deciduous growth was bare. Frank went into the trees about 30 feet while I watched from the road. He looked at the ground in there and came back out and said there was no mark of passage that he could identify with confidence. The leaf layer under the canopy was undisturbed in the way undisturbed leaf layer looks in November, which is settled and flat, and not showing the directional compression that a boot or a large animal's passage would leave. He said he could not be certain about it because he was not a tracker and the conditions were not ideal for tracking, but he was not seeing what he would expect to see if something had moved through that area recently. We also looked at the embankment on the left side, above the crash site. Frank climbed up about 15 feet and walked along the top of the bank and came back. He said the embankment surface was frost-hardened and he could not read it well, but there was no obvious sign of recent passage there either. Frank and I worked the verge area in a methodical grid, the same way you work a search area when you are looking for something specific. We covered the full 8-foot width of the verge and roughly 15 feet of length centered on the position the recording placed the form. What we found was the truck's tire impressions from the crash and the recovery, the boot tread from Torres, Frank's own prints from the night of the incident, and my boot prints from when Torres and his partner helped me out of the truck. In the area the recording placed the form, there was nothing. The leaf layer was undisturbed. The soil beneath it, where Frank pressed his boot and showed me the impression it left, had not been compressed. Whatever the recording showed standing in that position for 47 minutes in, wet cold had left no mark on the ground. Frank photographed that area carefully, then got down on one knee and looked at the leaf layer at eye level, then stood back up and looked at the tree line, the road, and then the position of the milepost in the frame of his memory of the recording. He said, quietly, that whatever the camera had picked up, it had been standing in that exact spot, and it had left no trace. I had nothing to add. We drove back to Laurel Springs, and Frank sat at my kitchen table with the recordings and the measurements and a piece of paper, and he did the geometric work. He worked from the known height of the milepost, its visible position in the frame relative to the form, and the estimated distance based on what we knew about the shoulder width at that location. The calculation took him close to an hour, and he checked it twice. His estimate was 6 feet 3 to 6 feet 5. He noted the arm proportions as possibly anomalous, but said he could not put significant weight on that because arm length in an infrared recording at 22 feet in ambient darkness was not something you could measure with precision. When he was done, he said, "I do not know what that is, Ray." He meant that, exactly as he said it. Not as a way of ending the conversation, not as a courtesy. As a factual statement about the limits of what he could determine from the evidence in front of him. At the door, he stopped and turned back and said one more thing. He said he had been on that road for 16 years, and he had heard things in conversations over the years that he had let go past because there was nothing to do with them. Those things went unnamed. In retrospect, he wished he had written some of them down. That was the last time either of us referred to the incident directly for several months. In February of 2023, I contacted the Blue Ridge Parkway's Cultural Resources Coordinator for the North Carolina District, a woman named Janet Oakes, who had been in that role for 11 years. I told her I was doing some informal research on the stretch of parkway between mileposts 216 and 230, and I asked if she could look for any historical incident reports, maintenance records, or archived ranger logs that covered unusual observations in that area. I was vague about what specifically I was looking for, and she did not press me on it. She called me back 4 days later. The first thing she found was a maintenance crew log from July of 1987. A crew supervisor named Harlan, doing pavement crack seal work in the section near milepost 222, had entered a note at the end of the shift report. The note said that one of his workers had left the work site early, citing a person standing on the bank above the road who had been watching the crew since mid-morning. The supervisor had walked up the bank to investigate and found no one there. He had looked for recent sign of anyone in the area and found none. He noted in the log that the worker was, in his words, rattled enough to be useless for the rest of the afternoon. The second thing she found was older. An internal memo appended to a patrol log from March of 1971. A ranger on routine patrol had noted, in a handwritten addition at the bottom of his shift log, that he had observed what he initially took for a hunter, crossing the road near milepost 221. When he turned his patrol vehicle around to check, no one was visible on the road or either shoulder in either direction. He had exited the vehicle and looked along the road for 100 yards in each direction and had not found anyone. He had logged it as an unexplained pedestrian observation and moved on. 2 records, 16 years apart, in the general area of the same mile marker. The 1971 observation was at milepost 221, less than half a mile from my crash site at 221.4. The 1987 crew log placed the watcher at milepost 222, which is 0.6 miles from milepost 221.4, where I came off the road. Janet asked me, carefully, what I was specifically looking into. I told her it related to the crash in November, and that I was trying to understand whether there was any documented history of unusual observations in that section. She said there was a cultural anthropologist the Parkway occasionally consulted on matters of historical land use and traditional significance, who might be a useful person to contact. She offered to make the introduction. I said yes. The anthropologist was a woman named Dr. Caroline Birch at Appalachian State University in Boone. She had done extensive work on the pre-park history of the land the Parkway passes through in the North Carolina section, and she knew the stretch I was describing. She was specific about the limits of what she could tell me with confidence, and I respected that. What she could tell me was that the high ridges in that section of Allegheny County formed part of a well-documented travel corridor going back to the pre-Columbian period and continuing through the colonial and settlement eras. Mountain ridgelines that run relatively level for long distances are natural travel routes, and the Parkway follows one of these through the northern North Carolina section. The specific ridge I was asking about had both practical and, based on the limited archaeological and documentary evidence she had access to, ceremonial significance in the traditions of several of the peoples who had moved through that landscape. She mentioned, carefully, that there were concepts present in more than one of the traditions associated with that corridor that involved beings connected to transitional places, mountain passes and ridge crossings where one piece of country ended and another began. She was not willing to attribute this to any specific community's living tradition, but she said the documentary record from colonial-era ethnographies mentioned these concepts in connection with the southern Appalachian ridge systems. They were not described as protective or threatening in a simple sense. The word that appeared most often in the translated accounts was watcher. She asked if I wanted the specific citations. I said yes. She emailed them to me that afternoon, and I read through them over the following 2 weeks. The academic papers she sent were not something I had any prior experience reading. My reading background is crime reports, case law, agency policy documents, and the occasional legal brief. Academic anthropology is a different language, and I had to read some sections multiple times to get what they were saying under the technical vocabulary. What I found, reading carefully, was consistent with what Dr. Birch had described. The papers drew on colonial-era accounts, early ethnographic records, and archaeological survey data to describe the cultural significance of certain ridge systems in the southern Appalachians as zones of transition, places where the organized human world was understood to give way to something less ordered or less knowable. The beings associated with these zones in the documented traditions were described with some consistency across accounts. Large and still, appearing at moments of vulnerability, illness, injury, disorientation. They did not act in the way predators acted. These were beings that watched. One paper drew a distinction between two types of anomalous beings documented in the historical material. The first type was territorial, associated with specific resources, behaving according to comprehensible patterns of defense or acquisition. The second type had no apparent purpose that the accounts could identify. They appeared at moments of crisis and disappeared before the crisis resolved. They left no trace. Multiple accounts described people who had been injured or lost or ill in the mountains, reporting an awareness, on recovery, that something had been present during the period of incapacitation, something they had not been able to perceive at the time, but became aware of afterward. I read that section of the paper twice. The researcher noted, carefully, that she could not verify these accounts, could not determine whether they reflected genuine cultural memory of anomalous experiences or were metaphorical explanations for the psychological experience of surviving a dangerous event in a hostile environment. She was honest about the limits of what the record allowed her to conclude. I respected that. That was the sort of honesty I was trained to apply to evidence. What I can say is that the description in that paper and what the camera recorded at milepost 221.4 are close enough in their particulars that I noted the comparison in my private documentation of the incident. I am not saying they are the same thing. I am saying the particulars line up in ways that I find difficult to dismiss. I want to be careful about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I do not know what the camera recorded at milepost 221.4 on the night of the 14th of November 2022. I know what was in the frame for 47 minutes and 13 seconds. I know what was not on the ground the next morning. I know that two other people, across a span of 51 years, had noted something in the same general location. What the connection is between those facts, if there is a connection at all, is not something I can tell you. What I can tell you is that sitting in that truck for 47 minutes, alone, in the dark, with a broken wrist and cracked ribs, and the cold working into my feet through the floor, I did not feel afraid. I felt isolated and uncomfortable and focused on staying calm and waiting for backup. I did not feel watched. I had no awareness of anything outside the cab, and that, more than the recording itself, is the part I find hardest to account for. I was 22 feet away from it for 47 minutes, and I felt nothing. In March of 2023, I put in a request to my supervisor, District Ranger Norm Fitch, for a patrol section reassignment. Fitch had been with the Parkway for 26 years and had worked the northern North Carolina section himself for the first 11 of those years, before moving into his administrative role. I did not give him the full story. I told him the crash had given me some reluctance about that particular stretch of road, and I wanted a change of assignment. He thought about it for a moment, did not ask me to say more, looked at his desk, and then said, "That stretch has a way of getting under your skin." He approved the reassignment the same afternoon without further discussion. I have thought about that phrase many times since. In 26 years on the Parkway, Norm Fitch was not a man who chose words carelessly. He had not asked me what happened. He had not needed to. I have also thought about what it means that he said it at all. That stretch has a way of getting under your skin is not what a district ranger says reflexively in response to a reassignment request. It is what a person says when they are acknowledging something they have not said out loud, something they decided at some point not to address directly, but also decided not to pretend was not there. Norm Fitch had patrolled that section for 11 years before I arrived, and he had not transferred out. He had moved into his administrative role for the standard reasons of career progression and had a perfectly ordinary explanation for every professional decision he had ever made. But he said what he said that afternoon, and he said it without hesitation. And then he signed off on my paperwork and moved on to the next item on his desk, as though nothing notable had been said at all. I moved to the southern section in June of 2023, mileposts 380 through 469. the Asheville approach, and the long descent toward Cherokee. It is a different road in character. More traffic, more visitor infrastructure, more active use throughout the year. I adapted to it quickly enough. It is a fine section of Parkway to work, and I do not want to suggest otherwise. What I think about, when I let myself think about it, is the 47 minutes. I think about what it means that the recording shows the form moving from the road to the tree line in the interval of the crash, before the airbag had finished deflating, before I had reached for the radio. It had moved faster than I could account for and settled into a position 22 feet from the truck, and it had stayed there for 47 minutes and 13 seconds. There was no approach toward the truck, no contact with the vehicle. It stood at the edge of the forest and watched. And at the 23-minute mark, which was roughly 15 minutes before the EMS unit's arrival, it had turned its head to look at me directly. Whether it was responding to the distant sound of the approaching siren on the mountain roads below, or whether it was responding to something else entirely, I cannot say. But the timing is there, and I note it. Sandra asked me once, about 6 months after all of this, whether knowing had changed the way I felt about those 47 minutes. We were sitting on the back porch in the evening, and she asked it the way she asks things when she has been thinking about it for a while. Directly. I thought about it before I answered. I told her that when I was sitting in the truck, injured and cold in the dark, I had not felt afraid. I had felt alone and uncomfortable and focused on staying calm. And I told her that there is a particular feeling that comes over you when you realize, months afterward, that you were never alone for a single minute of those 47 minutes. That something was there from the moment the truck stopped moving to the moment the first headlights appeared in the distance. Something that could not be explained by tracks in the ground or any animal known to that landscape. Something that had turned its head at the 23-minute mark to look directly at the window beside the seat where I was sitting. She was quiet for a while after that. Sandra is not a dramatic person. She thinks before she speaks, and she takes things seriously. After a bit, she said, "It did not hurt you." That was what she said. It did not hurt you. I have thought about that a great deal too. Whatever the recording showed standing at that tree line for nearly an hour on a cold November mountain road, it did nothing. It stood and it watched, and when help arrived, it was gone. Whether that absence of action constitutes something benign or neutral, or simply something operating by rules I have no access to, I cannot say. I am a law enforcement officer. I document what the evidence shows. The evidence shows a presence that did not harm me and did not interfere and was gone before anyone else arrived to see it. The recording is still on my laptop. I have not deleted it, and I have considered why more than once. The practical reason is that it is a piece of evidence in my incident report documentation, and I treat evidence the way I was trained to treat it. The other reason is harder to put into plain language. Whatever was standing at that tree line had a head that it turned to look at where I was, and I find that I feel I owe it the acknowledgement of keeping the record of it, that it was there, that the camera saw it, that I saw what the camera saw. I drove past milepost 221.4 once after my reassignment last September, when a permit inspection up near Doughton Park brought me back through that section of road on the return. I slowed down as I came around the curve. The right shoulder was ordinary. The tree line was a tree line. The milepost stood at the edge of the road the way it always had. I drove through without stopping. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. I did not look in the rearview mirror until I was well past the bend. The recording is 47 minutes and 13 seconds long, from the first clear post-crash frame to the moment the form disappeared. I have not timed how long I can sit and watch it before I have to close the laptop. I have not tried to find out. Some pieces of evidence you process and file and move past. This one I have not been able to put in that category. I expect I will continue carrying it with me for some time yet, and I have made my peace with that.